Well, Cathy, first of all, I want to honor your experience as a survivor and things you've seen and experienced and the difference that you're making. So I want to thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Cathy, when I was reading your book, Innocence Revisited, I was really gripped by your experience of almost uncovering what happened to you as a child. And I think that's often the thing about going through a traumatic experience. It's so difficult to make sense of the situation. So, when you're dealing with a traumatic time or a difficult experience in your life, what can help you to make sense of the situation, of what's going on?
Look, I mean, I'll speak from my experience, and it was particularly challenging for me because I didn't remember what had happened to me. And so learning about it happened in stages and happened in fragments, and because traumatic memory is often stored in fragments. And when we say we remember trauma, in this sense, we don't remember it, we relive it. And you relive it in your body with, feelings and sensations and emotions, which are very alive. And it's like reliving a part of what happened to you, but not necessarily with the context. So you have all these bits coming back and you're trying to put them together to, not just to make sense of what happened and why, but what actually did happen. Before you can begin to make sense of it, you need to have a sense of, well, what was it? And so for me, that process was about building a narrative of my own past, which I did, both from those experiences that came back to me, but also from a lot of exploration. And I gradually pieced it together. And as I pieced it together, what it did was help to explain a lot about me that perhaps had been a little bit mysterious to me, and things made much more sense, and I gained a lot more clarity, because if you don't know what you've gone through, it's really hard to know who you are, where you fit in the world. So I mean, that's a particular experience.
Yeah, exactly. And what sort of things did you learn about yourself, about the person that you are? Because I think it's such a big distinction, as you say, about the traumatic experience of what you lived through, but also the impact that it's had on your life.
Yeah. Well, what I learned was that until I had some sense of all of that story, that I was very defended and cut off, that I actually was not as emotionally available as I would have liked to have been, or feel I am now. And certainly with my family and with people who are close to me. So, and I also was probably quite, I used humor, I still use humor. It's a very good defense, but my humor then was probably a little sharper than it is now, and a little blacker. And, that was a way of me, staying in control without really being in control at all. I suppose the other thing I really learned over time was that, I had a very fully developed sense of myself. So I was a doctor, and that sounds a bit weird that, as a doctor you have a self-definition, but my self-definition was in that role. It wasn't about who I was as a human being. And, I gradually had to build a sense of who I was. And, what I realized was that, I hadn't really learned about what it was I liked, what I didn't like. I didn't, I hadn't been free for whatever reason to make choices in my life, even though I might have thought I did. And, that's quite a realization, because I was, in my mid-40s when I realized that. And that was a really challenging process and quite confronting. So, you know, I thought I was, you know, pretty functional and pretty competent. And, you know, to the external world, maybe I was, but there were some bits missing in a way. And, you know, unless you, yeah, and I suppose I had a very sort of poor sense of self-worth as well. I didn't value myself. I didn't care for myself. I didn't know how to look after myself. In fact, I wasn't high on the priority at all. And that's something, you know, many survivors and struggle with, and I still struggle with that to a degree. So yeah, I learnt a lot, but it was over, you know, a long, circuitous period of time, and supported by a, you know, pretty intense therapeutic process, just to help hold me and help me to feel safe, um, you know, while I went on this journey of exploration, personal exploration.
And I love this metaphor of the journey, because its journey is something that means you are, as you say, you're exploring. You. It doesn't have a deadline, and journey. It means you can try things and see what makes sense or how it kind of fits in together, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're all on a permanent journey. You know, I don't think, you know, I don't think. I mean, there is an end point, but that's a different, you know, that's a different concept. And we're all evolving. I mean, I suppose this is just a bit more of an intense process of evolution than one that some others, you know, go through. I mean, you know, when at the beginning of this process, I had a realization that I had really no memory or virtually no memory of 10 years of my childhood, you know, good or bad. And that was really quite confronting because, you know, again, you know, I was a GP, I was, you know, reasonably functional, but yet there was this big gap. And, you know, what I realized is that I used to, you know, cover it up. I'd learned how to, you know, explain it away. But it was scary. It was really frightening. And it would certainly leave me feeling quite alienated in sort of everyday conversations when people were reminiscing about, you know, what they ate for lunch at school. And I had no idea. I couldn't put myself back there at all. So that was a challenging part of the process as well.
Absolutely, and it really speaks to me that feeling, that sense of being lost. I almost feel like there are parts of my life where I feel they're almost covered in mist. Like I almost had like almost like a physical sensation of things being not clear. Like you're wandering around, and you can't even see things. We talk about clarity. I think it's a very real thing. Like it almost was confusing and confounding, in that way. And I think that decision, I know you spoke about freedom and you spoke about choices. I think that decision to go and try to figure that out is super courageous, because I think it's very difficult to face that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I didn't make the decision. The decision was made for me because I became very unwell. And so I had what in the sort of, you know, old terminology is called a breakdown. And so from being a, you know, a busy GP, with 4 kids, you know, being able to do, you know, most things with apparent ease, I was virtually bedbound, and completely, unable to, yeah, to do most things. And so, you know, it was foisted on me to need to need to start to explore. Um, but yeah, you know, it was a tough journey, for sure, and you know, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone, but one that I needed to have because I do think it's given me, you know, lot of clarity. Um, you know, I'll never know everything that happened, and that doesn't matter. But what it's helped me to do is make sense of who I am, make sense of who I am in the world, and how I relate to others. And I think that that's pretty bottom line.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you were going through that experience, you're obviously, like as you're saying, you're supported by a therapeutic process. And was there anything that you were doing that helped you to piece things together? Were you writing things down in some way? Were you talking through things with people? What was helpful to you?
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few things that were helpful. Obviously, the therapeutic process and being held, but that was a space that was again an experience I hadn't had to feel so safe, to feel like someone kept you in mind, to actually build a sense of trust, and that took a long, long time for me to be able to do that. I had some close friends who actually knew that it was okay to say, I don't know what to say,
Mhm.
but I'm here, for what you need. I also, because I need to understand, I became an avid reader of psychology books and cleaned out the local library very quickly. Just trying to explore and make sense. And for me, writing, is really, really powerful. And so as I recovered, these fragments of what I'd experienced, I'd write them down. But it was much more of a catharsis. It was a purge, and it was a stream of consciousness. But as I tried to weave my book together, what that was, and there was a lot of working and reworking, and I'd write it very differently now, because I thought at the time it was very processed, and when I look back, it's probably, not nearly as processed as I thought it was. But that weaving together of those different fragments and trying to make sense of it helped to weave me and the different parts of myself together. And writing for me is a way that I can get trauma out and sort of out onto a page. And that was interesting in therapy because for a long time I couldn't speak about what was happening or what I was remembered had happened. I think because obviously the shame was overwhelming. But I'd take in some of what I'd written and give it to my therapist, and eventually I could start to read it, and then I could start to speak. And so it was a medium um, for getting it out and where it could be examined, putting it in the light, where it could be thought about, spoken about, explored. And I also did some investigations into my past, so looking in various places to try and secure dates and work out what happened when, because part of what I also struggle with, and I still struggle to this day, is with chronology, and sort of putting things in order, because that's part of what was impacted by the trauma.
Absolutely. And I want to also speak to, the process of therapy, because I think it's something that is sometimes necessary when you've been through traumatic experience, but it's also difficult to do because, as you say, it requires building trust with someone. It allows you to it kind of you have to be vulnerable. You have to be in a position where you're ready to share it. And also the fact that you don't know where it's going to go, and you don't really know what to expect, right? Because
Yeah,
right, I don't really know, like I guess for many years one of the reasons why I did not access any kind of therapy is you don't really know what to
yeah.
expect, right? Like you don't know how it works.
Well, and you also need to let go of control. you
Yes.
you know, which and certainly in my case, I was someone who learned to be fiercely independent because my world was dangerous, and I felt frequently under threat. And so I learned at that time that the only person I could trust was myself. And of course, that's not a great way to go through the world. And so that's why building trust with a therapist took a long time. But it was an incredibly painful, difficult, but yet empowering process. So, you know, and certainly at times it got worse before it got better. And the other thing, you know, that I learned from therapy was that, you know, the slower you go, the faster you get there. You know, so it's certainly for me, and I had a therapist who, you know, walked alongside me for a long, long time. But if ever she even gave me the gentlest nudge, that would actually have a negative effect because it was so fragile. My process was so fragile. And I had no control over what was coming up and coming out. And so, yeah, I had no plan. I'm sure she did. But, you know, we'd always work with what I presented with on the day in the session. And, you know, we'd you know, sit together and, you know, it was reliving it was incredibly traumatic for me, and I'm sure for her. Because there was some pretty, you know, awful stuff that we had to try and then make sense of stuff. And, you know, some of it is not anything you can ever really make sense of. And I suppose that was part of what I had to accept, that I certainly would never know totally what happened to me. And I would never be able to explain why in that sense. But I could understand much better myself and understand, as I said before, who I am. And that's, you know, and build an emotional sensitivity that I think was blunted before. And, you know, as a human being, you know, I feel much more comfortable with myself and my relationships, and certainly with family relationships, which are the most critical of all. And that's been an incredible, you know, process for everyone in our family. Obviously, it's been incredibly. My trauma's been incredibly traumatic, both in the reliving, but also in the, you know, the impacts of when it wasn't understood, wasn't known, the way I was engaging or not engaging.
And as you say, there is a release that you almost start to feel again in a way, and also that there's a I think a vital sense that you speak to as well, that I'm also on that journey of acceptance. And when I say acceptance, I mean self-acceptance, accepting yourself, accepting your experience, whether you have all the answers or not, but accepting yourself as you are. How does that process of, I guess, self-acceptance, how does it work for you, and how does it support you in just living the daily life?
Yeah, well, for me, you know, because I had all these fragments, I was also in parts, in a sense. We all have different parts of ourselves, but for me, they were really quite separate. And what I had to do was accept all the different parts of myself. And some of those parts were parts that I was profoundly ashamed of, because of, you know, the abuse I'd experienced. And it's a very common response, is that you blame yourself, you feel bad, and you also judge yourself incredibly harshly. And so what I had to do was start to accept those parts that I really wanted to get rid of, you know, that I actually, you know, denied. And, you know, I remember my therapist, you know, telling me to embrace them. You know, I wanted to clout her because, you know, thought of embracing, you know, something that to me was so aversive on some level. But of course, it was part of who I am, and we're all, you know, we've all got this whole dynamic range. And so it was, accepting. And I'm not saying I'm finished or done. You know, I don't want, you know, that to, you know, it's always an ongoing process. But accepting, you know, those different parts of myself and those different experiences, and accepting that, you know, I'm never going to know it all, but this is how I got here. And then, okay, you know, we've got the sense of ourselves, and you know, and we decided, you know, we know what we want, we know we can make choices. It's a different way to go through the world, and we've got, you know, some very meaningful relationships because we're able to, you know, build better relationships, more meaningful relationships. And so, yeah, it's just it's a healthier way to go through the world rather than, you know, withdrawing into your own space. You know, we're relational beings, and you know, it makes sense that when you've been harmed in relationships, you don't fear them. But as you gradually build trust, and for me, it was initially in a therapeutic space, but that then generalizes, and you can trust other relationships more. And the more open you are, the more you will let others in.
So talk to me about building trust, Cathy. So what's helped you to build trust with people who are already in your life, but also with people you were meeting on as you were going through this journey of healing and I guess self-discovery? What do you feel has been helpful to you in building trust? Is it being more open? Is it letting go of control?
Look,
What's
it's an interesting process because, you know, when you've been betrayed, you know, in such a fundamental way by the people who really should care and nurture you, care for and nurture you, it does take a long time. And you also, you know, don't develop a sense of healthy boundaries because you've been, you know, your boundaries have been violated. And so it's a very gradual, you know, it's like any new skill. You know, you practice it and you're fairly clumsy when you start off. You know, so there was a time when I started to learn more about myself, and I'd, you know, sort of tell everyone, well, that's not, you know, that's not ideal because you need to be selective about who, where, what, when. And you learn that, you know, you learn that by, you know, small steps and, you know, finding out, no, that was not ideal. You know, how do I do it differently next time? And so it's a very gradual, stepwise process, and it's not, you know, I said to be more open, but yes, to a degree, but there's also this sort of learning, gradual learning process. And, you know, certainly in therapy, I mean, a lot of that was modeled for me as well. You know, the boundaries of therapy were very, very sustaining. And, you know, certainly my therapist was there for me, you know, as unconditionally as someone could be. But she also, you know, kept boundaries that helped to show me what that was like, but also to keep me safe until I could do it for myself.
so when you say about keeping boundaries in that context, like what does that look like?
So we had, you know, so as a therapist, we had set times. She was always on time, or, you know, very minor exceptions. Sessions finished when they were meant to finish. They didn't go over time. She did allow me to call after hours when there were particular reasons for it, but when there weren't, you know, she chose that. So it was about an understanding, you know, because there was a while where I was just so needy that I would have been, you know, happy to, you know, sit in her house permanently. You know, so it was about her doing what she needed to keep me safe, but also showing me and me gradually, you know, developing those internal skills myself, so that then I'd have much better judgment about what was appropriate and what was not appropriate, and my need decreased over time as well.
That makes total sense, and I think that process of setting boundaries and understanding what works for you is, like you say, so crucial to building trust. I now almost look at reevaluating relationships, whether that's at work or with friends or in the family, evaluating them from that perspective of trust. Like, can I trust
Yeah.
you with sharing my thoughts, ideas, feelings, right?
Yeah, that's right. And who do you trust with what? And it's about learning, who are your, and I remember my therapist saying if you have 2 or 3 friends that, are really there for you, really there for you in a mutual way, that's quite remarkable. And, we all have, and it's not to minimize the other relationships, but it's about being realistic about what to expect, and also knowing that, it's difficult for others to be there at times as well. And so, it's very important for, people in the family and carers to also get their own support, because it's quite challenging walking alongside as a loved one of someone going through, profound trauma and healing, and it's very confusing. So it's about, how do they also get the support and self-care that they need to be able to sustain that journey. So, it's both challenging and inspiring to see someone heal and recover. But it's a circuitous journey, and everyone needs good support and to be able to make sense of what's going on as well.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to just your heart and what you're doing with your book and with Blue Note, and in your desire to help and support and inspire others. Tell me, how did that come up? That need or desire to share that story in a way that helps others.
Look, I mean, I think my story was initially about me making sense of myself. But I also realized that I was a privileged survivor in that I had the resources to get really good support. And I know that, it can be very challenging. And I'm not saying therapy is everyone's journey. Everyone's got their own unique path to journey, to healing. But I saw, the change in myself, and that, there is hope, and there are possibilities for healing. And I also found that when I was struggling, as I said, I read the psychology section of the library, but I also read people's stories, and I also read, and you can feel so alone on this journey. You can feel like you're the only person who's ever experienced it. And reading, other people's stories, that they may not have had the same things happen, but there are commonalities, and it makes you feel less alone, and it helps you to see, that they're having reactions, like you have, and you're not crazy. This is about trauma, and about the way trauma affects the brain and the body. This is about trauma reactions. It's about survival. And so, that can help you also just stop blaming yourself as much for your own traumatic journey and for its impacts and the way you've coped, and whatever the picture is, it can just help. And so I suppose my story, I felt also could potentially, help others in that way. And, as I say, I would write it differently now. I do think it's a bit raw, but people have also said that it has helped them. So, that's great. Everyone, finds their own path, and certainly in mental health and in the trauma field, the voice of lived and living experience is finally becoming much more valued, and it's much more at the center of everything, as it should be, because who knows, better than the person themselves. Not saying that they don't need help and support, but I mean, people's stories are unique, and they all deserve be honoured and to be heard, and and the bottom line is people need to be believed.
People need to be believed, people need to be heard, and that connection as well is so important, connecting with people who have been through a similar experience, to, as you say, to hear these stories and to meet people who've been through it.
And also to see that people can live full and rich lives despite or with what happened to them, because there are times where you can certainly lose hope. And that was the other thing my therapist did for me. She held on to hope when I really struggled to feel it myself. And she was right. There is a, I'm not being Pollyanna. It's not easy, but, there are pathways, and we know, and we hear, stories of recovery a lot. And we know from the research that, with neuroplasticity, the brain can change and can heal and can repair. And that's the message that we need to get out.
Absolutely. And tell me, how did Blue Knot Foundation, how did that come about?
So, Blue Knot is followed an organization called ASCA, so it was rebranded. So ASCA is an organization that's been around since 1995, and it was established by 3 survivors of child sexual abuse who couldn't find anywhere to go to. And it was an organization that I found in my journey, and because I was looking for whatever I could find to help. And so I joined ASCA over 20 years ago, and gradually became, on the board and part of it. And we changed our name to Blue Knot because ASCA stood for adults surviving child abuse, and surviving felt like it was just surviving, and didn't really capture the hope that we're talking about and the possibilities for healing. And so Blue Knot Foundation, we've got a logo, which is a metaphor, and that logo is a tangled knot, and that's the confusion and the chaos of trauma. And it gradually gets smoothed out over time, and so that's what Blue Knot brings. And blue because it's the color of the sky, it's the color of possibility, it's the color of hope. And so that's Blue Knot. And what we are is an organization that works with people who've experienced all forms of interpersonal, so person-to-person trauma, so violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, often as a child, but not exclusively. And we know that sometimes people experience repeated trauma through their lives in different ways. So we call that complex trauma. And so our organisation works with people who've had those experiences, and we've selected the area of complex trauma because people don't appreciate the difference from the trauma of a single incident, and not to minimise anyone's trauma. But when we're talking about a natural disaster, a flood, a fire, or a single assault as an adult, it obviously has a significant impact. But when you've experienced repeated trauma, often as a child, when the brain is growing and developing, it can have a much more profound impact on your sense of self, on your relationships, on your physical and mental health, and so forth. And so we felt that we really needed to differentiate that, because what it means is that there needs to be different approaches and different understandings around supporting people with complex trauma. Why does it take 4 years before you can trust a counsellor? Why do people, some people with complex trauma have never felt safe. It's not about going back to a space of safety. It's about, finding a space of safety in your own body and with others in the first place. So there are different elements to it, and that needs to be understood. And so, it's a different journey.
So what are some of those needs when people who go through complex trauma, as you say, repeated abuses, sometimes things, I think as you said, they come up later in life as well, and there are things that perhaps the impact of it, or that lack of safety or lack of trust, does that also sometimes create, exposure to other difficult things throughout life?
Look, I mean, everyone's an individual, and this is a very broad brush. So complex trauma can impact people, in many, many ways. But what we haven't talked about is the way people cope. And people cope, as best they can. Because what happens when you experience repeated trauma, the world is dangerous. And so you're often, almost permanently in survival mode. So you've got a very heightened nervous system, and you're very allergic to any threat or perceived threat. And what that can mean is that, people are often, very heightened, very anxious. And so people acquire all sorts of coping strategies to try and calm that, to try and numb that angst or distress. And that can include, things such as, substance misuse, self-harm, overeating, over-exercising, overworking. So some are more socially acceptable than others, but there are various ways people just try and calm that nervous system, and that needs to be understood. But those coping strategies, of course, cause their own flow-on effects as well, and can impact, health and social engagement, and so it's a very complex picture, and also just the physiological effects of that overactive nervous system, can affect, people's health and well-being. So it's a very complex picture. Some people, because they were unable to settle even as a young child, haven't been able to complete an education, or they grew up in a family which, of neglect, in which that wasn't possible. So, and that of course impacts their ability to hold down a job later in life. So, I mean, it's just such a complex picture.
So sounds like what the support is needs to be also thought of differently in terms of time as well, right? For someone with complex trauma.
I mean, people go in and out of reaching for support. So because people struggle to trust, people don't come into doctor's surgeries and say, I have complex trauma, help me. It's it's, so reluctant to reach out, often feel and have been not well understood by all sorts of health practitioners, and often re-traumatized in experiences of seeking help. So there's a complex combination of factors there as well as to why it's not so easy to reach out for support. We have people ringing our helplines saying, this is the first time in which I've had someone just sit and listen to me, not interrupt, not try and, say something trite, but just hear me, and just that being heard, and, feeling that the person on the other side at a fundamental level understands the experience. That's profound. And it's improving gradually, but there's a long way to go in terms of understanding. And, as human beings, we judge, very quickly. And, there are many adults who, are just struggling day to day. They may be struggling to find housing. They've used alcohol, their whole life. But no one in general, thinks, oh, they've experienced complex trauma. How can we help? Think, oh my God, why can't you get your act together? So how do we as a society change that understanding, so that we can be there to support people wherever they are, in whatever space they are.
Yeah, that's so vital, Cathy. And when you say, yeah, it's such a, but when you describe that experience of even being heard and being seen, I guess, as a person with complex needs, with a with history, with as a kind of multifaceted human
Yeah,
being.
correct.
It's so it's so vital to take that into account
Yeah.
when when we're dealing with people. And so if someone was wanting to reach out to a helpline, I guess what would they expect? Like what sort of what would the call look like, even on a practical level, or
Well,
what
it,
would
it depends. It depends on what they present with, what they want. It's about the counsellor being there to respond to the person in the moment. But often a lot of people will be agitated, and what's useful is to do some grounding exercises, to develop some strategies for managing, strategies around being triggered, some education around trauma, and trauma in the body, and how the body reacts, and to help people understand that what's going on in their life is not their fault, but it makes sense in the context of what happened to them. And then trying to understand, well, what supports do you have around you? Who is there? Because often there may be someone there, but it's very hard for you to see. And sort of understanding, what is it someone needs in that moment, and then obviously, going forward as well.
exactly? And as you say, there is you work also with doctors and medical professionals to support them about their needs around what are
Yeah.
some of the best ways to work with complex trauma. What is it that you think that we need, I guess, as a society, in terms of doctors, to
Well,
support people with complex trauma better?
well, look, we have a very growing training arm, and we provide training to a lot of practitioners, not just medical practitioners, health practitioners, legal practitioners, so on and so forth, to really give them the basics around understanding trauma and how to be trauma informed, how to respond in the first instance, not doing any harm, how to respond to the person that you're engaging with, how to have trauma on the radar. So if someone is presenting to a medical practitioner, that they'll start to think that, yes, they've got this presenting symptom, but what may be underpinning it? And doctors are often in the best position because they've known people over a period of time, and they know families over a period of time, so they have the context. But it's about that primary education, and then how to, so how to engage, connect, how to find out what it is, same as I was saying before, what that person needs. And we also train people who are working therapeutically in how to respond to people with complex trauma. So how to keep people safe, how to stabilize them, how to help them feel secure, how to help them understand the ways they've coped, and start to think about, well, maybe there are more constructive ways. So there's many different ways that we sort of build capacity in the different sectors, but it's all about how do we make a more humane world that is there to be aware of people with trauma experiences, and to be able to support them either themselves, or understand the pathways for possible support, but how to be person-centered, respond in a human way, not judge, understand, accept, and help support the person to understand and accept themselves.
That is a powerful vision, Cathy. And I just want to bring it back to you now, because you do this incredible work and making a difference, and supporting and empowering survivors, and supporting, creating a way to help folks who've been through or might be living with difficult circumstance. So I just want to quote the line from your book. I think it's a closing line that's really struck me, is when you say, as I emerge from my personal Holocaust into the light of a new day, I gaze across at the dawning of the next phase of my life, and I'm truly blessed. I know, there's so much light and beauty in that. It kind of distills, I think, some of the um, work that you're doing out in the world. So I just want to ask you, Cathy, it's just to close off, what I guess are you grateful for? What gives you hope the most right now?
What am I grateful for? I'm very grateful for an amazing family that I have, who's been, we've all been on, a challenging, difficult journey together. But it's so connected, so alive, it's so rich. And I also, am grateful for just the possibility of healing. For and and the fact that society now is having many more of these conversations. It's becoming a little bit more open, and we're starting to see some change. And we're starting to see, a bit more understanding, a bit more of a shift, and hopefully that'll pick up a head of pressure and continue to move forward. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Cathy. Thank you for what you do in the world, and thank you for being here.